the sunken Spanish galleon that would captivate treasure hunters and marine archaeologists from across the globe. A forgotten colonial-era shipwreck holding over $400 million in gold, silver, and priceless artifacts. All discovered because one grieving widow refused to sell land everyone called worthless. This is the story of how Margaret Wilson's determination to honor her late husband's memory transformed a muddy Florida swamp into the archaeological discovery of the decade. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The persistent drone of mosquitoes was Margaret Wilson's constant companion as she trudged through knee-deep water, her rubber boots sinking into the soft mud with each step. At 53, the recently widowed woman had inherited what locals in Blackwater, Florida mockingly called the money pit, 40 acres of seemingly worthless swampland that her husband Thomas had stubbornly refused to sell during his lifetime. "You're wasting your time, Maggie," called Raymond Peters, her neighbor of 15 years, watching from the relative comfort of solid ground. Tom held onto this land for decades and never got a penny from it. "The county's offering a fair price. Take it while you can." Margaret wiped sweat from her brow, her gray-streaked hair plastered to her forehead in the oppressive humidity. 6 months after Thomas's sudden heart attack, she was still drowning in medical bills and funeral costs. The property tax on this land alone threatened to empty what remained of their modest savings. Yet something stopped her from signing the county's purchase offer. "Tom believed in this place," she replied, swatting at another mosquito. "He always said there was something special here. I need to understand what he saw before I let it go." Raymond shook his head sympathetically. Everyone in Blackwater knew Thomas Wilson had been eccentric, a former history teacher with an obsession for colonial Spanish settlements that had once dotted Florida's coastline. He'd purchased this swampland 30 years ago for reasons he'd never fully explained, spending countless weekends tramping through the muck with metal detectors and old maps, returning home exhausted but oddly content. "Well, don't stay out too late," Raymond cautioned before departing. "Storm's coming in from the Gulf tonight." Alone with her thoughts, Margaret continued her survey of the property. Thomas had kept meticulous journals of his explorations, journals she'd begun reading in the lonely evenings since his passing. His passion had been infectious even on paper, his certainty that this forgotten corner of Florida held historical significance leaping from every page. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, she approached what Thomas had labeled in his notes as the Central Basin, a particularly deep section of the swamp where cypress trees grew in a rough circle around a depression in the land. Something about the formation had always fascinated him, its perfect symmetry seeming almost artificial rather than natural. Margaret paused, pulling out a weathered map from her waterproof bag. Thomas had marked this spot repeatedly across decades of exploration, adding notes and measurements each year. His last entry, dated just weeks before his death, contained a single underlined phrase: "Seasonal water levels lowest in 30 years. Structure becoming visible." Looking around, Margaret could see nothing but murky water and tangled vegetation. Whatever Thomas had glimpsed remained hidden beneath the surface. As promised, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, their dark masses promising heavy rain by nightfall. With a sigh, she turned back toward the small cabin Thomas had built at the edge of the property, their weekend retreat during happier times. She'd spend one more night surrounded by his books and maps before making her decision about the county's offer. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The storm arrived with biblical intensity, rain pounding the cabin roof like artillery fire while wind howled through the cypress trees. Margaret sat at Thomas's cluttered desk, a single lamp illuminating the journal open before her. Lightning flashed across the sky, briefly transforming night to day, and in those fractured moments of illumination, something caught her attention through the window. The swamp was changing. Each lightning strike revealed more land than water where the Central Basin should be. The storm was literally draining the swamp, the water flowing rapidly toward an unseen outlet. Margaret watched in fascination as the level visibly dropped with each passing hour. By dawn, exhausted but unable to sleep, she stood on the cabin porch watching the rain finally taper off. The transformation was astonishing. Where yesterday there had been a water-filled depression, today there was exposed mud and something else. Something decidedly not natural. Pulling on her boots once more, Margaret ventured out into the aftermath of the storm. The ground was treacherous, saturated and unstable, but her curiosity drove her forward. As she approached the central basin, her heart began pounding with a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion. Protruding from the mud was a wooden beam, massive and darkened with age. Beside it, partially uncovered by the receding water, was an unmistakable curved shape, the wooden rib of what could only be a ship's hull. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "You were right all along." Margaret's fingers trembled as she reached for her phone to take photographs, only to find no signal in this remote corner of the property. This discovery would have to wait a few hours to be shared. Instead, she carefully approached the exposed wood, mindful of the unstable ground beneath her feet. The timber was massive, nearly 2 feet thick and clearly hand-hewn in a style not seen in centuries. Marine growth and sediment covered much of it, but in places, she could make out what appeared to be decorative carvings weathered by time and water. This was no modern vessel, this was something ancient. Her mind raced with questions. How had a ship this size ended up miles inland from the current coastline? How long had it been buried here? And most importantly, was this what Thomas had spent 30 years searching for? Returning to the cabin, Margaret rifled through Thomas's most detailed maps of the region. One in particular caught her eye, a reproduction of a 1713 Spanish chart showing the coastline as it existed 3 centuries earlier. The Gulf had extended much further inland then, with a deep natural harbor precisely where their property now stood. According to Thomas's notes, the harbor had gradually silted up following a catastrophic hurricane in 1715, eventually becoming the swamp she knew today. That same hurricane, Margaret recalled from Thomas's research, had claimed an entire Spanish treasure fleet off Florida's coast, most of which had been recovered over the centuries. But one ship, the Santa Isabella, had vanished completely from historical records after departing Havana, never reaching its intended port. Could it be? Had Thomas somehow tracked the missing galleon to this inland location, believing it had been driven far ashore by the hurricane's unprecedented storm surge, eventually to be swallowed by the changing landscape? With shaking hands, Margaret retrieved the county's purchase offer from her bag, staring at the number that had seemed so reasonable yesterday, $175,000 for 40 acres of wetlands unsuitable for development. She set it aside and instead reached for the phone, scrolling to find a contact Thomas had programmed years ago but never called, Dr. Eleanor Vasquez, professor of maritime archaeology at the University of Florida. "I need to report a discovery," Margaret said when the call connected. "I believe I've found a Spanish galleon buried in my swamp." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, did you say a galleon? In a swamp?" "Yes," Margaret confirmed, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "And I think it might be the Santa Isabella." The name produced an immediate reaction. "That's impossible," Dr. Vasquez replied, though Margaret detected a note of intrigue beneath the skepticism. "The Santa Isabella disappeared at sea over 300 years ago. My husband spent 30 years researching this property. He believed the coastline was different then, that a storm could have carried the ship inland before the harbor silted up." "That's theoretically possible," Dr. Vasquez admitted. "But extraordinarily unlikely." "I'm looking at a massive wooden hull right now," Margaret countered. "Spanish construction, possibly early 18th century based on my husband's research. If you're interested, I can send photos, but I'll need you to come in person to verify." Another long pause. "I can be there tomorrow morning. Text me the address and any photos you can safely take." "And Mrs. Wilson? Please keep this discovery confidential until we can confirm what you found." As Margaret ended the call, a mixture of emotions washed over her, excitement, vindication, and a profound sadness that Thomas wasn't here to witness his theories proven right. She returned to the site, carefully photographing every visible part of the emerging structure as water continued to drain from the basin. By late afternoon, more of the vessel had been revealed, the unmistakable outline of a large galleon, its wooden hull remarkably preserved by the oxygen-poor environment of the swamp. Margaret's photos captured the ornately carved stern castle partially exposed above the mud, decorative elements still visible despite centuries of burial. That evening, she returned to Thomas's journals with new eyes, recognizing clues she'd previously overlooked. His systematic search pattern over decades, the soil samples he'd collected, even the odd metal fragments he'd occasionally discovered, all pointed to a methodical archaeological investigation conducted by a man with no formal training but boundless determination. "You almost found it, my love," she whispered, tracing his handwriting with her fingertip. "Just a few more months and you would have seen it." Sleep proved impossible that night. Margaret alternated between reviewing Thomas's research and standing on the porch, staring toward the basin where floodlights she'd set up illuminated the ghostly outline of the ship. By morning, she had compiled a comprehensive timeline of Thomas's investigation and prepared a detailed briefing for Dr. Vasquez. The archaeologist arrived shortly after 9, accompanied by 2 graduate students carrying sophisticated equipment. Dr. Vasquez was younger than Margaret had expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with intelligent eyes that widened considerably when she caught her first glimpse of the exposed timbers. "Remarkable," she breathed, immediately dropping to her knees to examine the wooden structure. "This is definitely colonial Spanish construction." She ran her fingers reverently along the carved wood. "Look at these decorative elements, classic early 18th century style." For the next several hours, the team conducted a preliminary assessment, taking samples for dating and mapping the outline of what was visible. With each new discovery, Dr. Vasquez's initial skepticism gave way to growing excitement. "The dimensions match what we know of the Santa Isabella," she confirmed late that afternoon. "And the location aligns with the 1715 hurricane's path. Your husband's theory about the changing coastline is actually supported by geological surveys of the region." Margaret felt tears forming. "So he was right all along." "Remarkably so," Dr. Vasquez agreed. "This is potentially one of the most significant maritime archaeological discoveries in decades. A completely intact Spanish galleon, preserved in anaerobic conditions, it's unprecedented." "What happens now?" Margaret asked. Dr. Vasquez's expression grew serious. "That's largely up to you, Mrs. Wilson. This is your property. Legally, anything found here belongs to you, though the historical significance would make proper archaeological excavation the ethical approach." "Thomas would have wanted it studied properly," Margaret said without hesitation. "He dedicated his life to understanding history, not profiting from it." The archaeologist smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. With your permission, I'd like to assemble a full research team. This excavation could take years, but it would be conducted with complete transparency. You would retain ownership of all artifacts recovered, with the university providing conservation services." As they discussed the details, Margaret's phone rang, the county assessor's office, likely calling to follow up on their purchase offer. She declined the call with a small smile. "Not selling anymore?" Dr. Vasquez asked perceptively. "No," Margaret replied. "This land was Thomas's legacy. I think I'll be holding on to it." What neither woman could have anticipated was how quickly news of the discovery would spread, despite their best efforts at confidentiality. By the following morning, a local fisherman had spotted the research team and captured drone footage of the partially exposed galleon, promptly uploading it to social media with the caption, "Spanish treasure ship found in Blackwater swamp." Within hours, the story had gone viral. By nightfall, news vans were parked at the entrance to Margaret's property, while her phone rang constantly with calls from journalists, television producers, and treasure hunting companies offering partnerships to recover the valuable cargo. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Dr. Vasquez sighed as they watched the growing media circus from the cabin window. "Once word gets out about a treasure ship, it attracts all kinds of attention, not all of it welcome." Margaret nodded grimly. The county assessor called again. "They've withdrawn their purchase offer and are now talking about eminent domain for a historical preservation area they suddenly want to create." "Convenient timing," Dr. Vasquez observed dryly. There's more, Margaret continued. A law firm representing the Spanish government contacted me. They're claiming ownership of the vessel as a Spanish naval ship, regardless of where it was found. Dr. Vasquez wasn't surprised. That's standard practice. Spain has successfully claimed ownership of several colonial shipwrecks discovered in American waters. It's complicated maritime law. Margaret's expression hardened. This isn't in water anymore. It's on private land that's been in American territory for over 2 centuries. Land my husband purchased legally and I inherited. The legal battles over shipwreck ownership have lasted decades in some cases, the archaeologist warned. And that's before we even confirm what cargo might be aboard. That evening, Margaret made a difficult decision. Inviting Dr. Vasquez and her team into the cabin, she laid out Thomas's complete research, 30 years of meticulous documentation, legal precedents he'd studied, and contingency plans he'd developed should his theory prove correct. Thomas anticipated every possible challenge, she explained, spreading his papers across the table. Including potential claims from Spain and attempts by local government to seize the property. Dr. Vasquez examined the documents with growing admiration. Your husband wasn't just a history enthusiast, he was a strategic genius. These preparations are incredibly thorough. Among the papers was a letter Thomas had written to Margaret, to be opened only if a significant discovery was made after his death. With trembling hands, she broke the seal and read his final guidance aloud. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then my life's work has finally yielded results, though I didn't live to see them. I've prepared for every contingency, legal claims, government interference, media attention, all documented in the accompanying files. But most importantly, remember this, what we've found belongs to history first, to knowledge and understanding of our past. The monetary value, while significant, is secondary. Trust Eleanor Vasquez if you've contacted her, her reputation for ethical archaeology is unmatched. And remember that I didn't spend 30 years searching for treasure, but for truth. All my love, Thomas. The room fell silent as Margaret carefully refolded the letter. When she looked up, her eyes held a new determination. We're going to do this right, she announced. For Thomas. The following morning, Margaret Wilson held her first press conference from the edge of her property. Flanked by Dr. Vasquez and a hastily assembled legal team recommended in Thomas's contingency plans, she addressed the gathered reporters with calm dignity. Yesterday, a Spanish galleon believed to be the Santa Isabella was discovered on my property, she began, her voice steady despite the battery of cameras. Based on preliminary examination, the vessel appears largely intact after more than 3 centuries. My late husband, Thomas Wilson, dedicated 30 years to researching this site, correctly theorizing that changing coastlines had left this historical treasure inland. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. I've entered into a formal agreement with the University of Florida for a proper archaeological excavation. Any artifacts recovered will be properly conserved, studied, and eventually displayed in appropriate museums. While I maintain legal ownership as the property holder, I consider myself a steward rather than an owner of history. A reporter shouted from the crowd, "Is it true the ship contains gold worth hundreds of millions?" Margaret smiled. We have no confirmation of cargo contents at this time. The archaeological team will conduct a systematic excavation that prioritizes historical documentation over treasure hunting. Another voice called out, "Are you aware the Spanish government is claiming ownership?" We are in preliminary discussions with Spanish representatives, she acknowledged. However, numerous legal precedents support the landowner's claim in similar cases. We're confident a cooperative agreement can be reached that respects both Spanish heritage and American property rights. As questions continued to fly, Margaret maintained her composure, drawing strength from Thomas's foresight. He had predicted every challenge, prepared for every complication, leaving her a roadmap through the chaotic aftermath of discovery. By the time excavation officially began 3 weeks later, Margaret had successfully navigated the initial legal challenges. The county's eminent domain attempt had been temporarily blocked by an injunction, while preliminary talks with Spanish cultural authorities were proceeding more amicably than expected. A formal archaeological partnership had been established between the University of Florida, the Florida State Historical Commission, and advisors from Spanish maritime museums. Under this agreement, Margaret retained nominal ownership while ensuring proper scientific excavation and public access to findings. What none of them anticipated was the breathtaking scale of the discovery that would emerge from the mud over the coming months. The Santa Isabella was revealed to be in a state of preservation unprecedented in maritime archaeology. The anaerobic environment of the swamp had protected wood, fabric, and even paper materials that would normally have disintegrated centuries ago. The hull was largely intact, with interior compartments still sealed, protecting their contents from exposure. And what contents they were! The initial inventory, meticulously catalogued by Dr. Vasquez's team, confirmed the Santa Isabella had been carrying a fortune: over 12 tons of silver coins and bars, hundreds of gold doubloons, emeralds from Colombia, and a previously undocumented collection of religious artifacts bound for Spain's royal chapel. Conservative estimates valued the treasure at approximately $420 million, a figure that made headlines worldwide and brought new waves of treasure hunters, journalists, and curious onlookers to Blackwater, Florida. Yet for Margaret, the most precious discoveries weren't the glittering hoards of precious metals. Instead, she treasured the human elements, perfectly preserved personal items belonging to passengers and crew, handwritten letters never delivered, and the captain's log documenting the ship's final desperate attempt to find shelter from the approaching hurricane. Each evening, after the excavation team departed, she would sit alone on the cabin porch, imagining Thomas beside her, sharing in the vindication of his life's work. The worthless swampland he'd stubbornly defended was now recognized as one of America's most significant archaeological sites, with museums and universities around the world vying for involvement. 1 year after the discovery, as a team of conservators carefully extracted a jewel-encrusted golden cross from the captain's quarters, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion. Thomas's vision had been fully realized, his theories proven correct in spectacular fashion. That night, she opened the last of his journals, one she had saved until this moment. On the final page, he had written a message dated just days before his unexpected death: "The water level continues to drop. I can almost see it now, the outline becoming visible in the center of the basin. After 30 years, I'm standing on the precipice of discovery. Whatever happens next, I know this journey was worth every moment, every doubt, every sacrifice." Some will see only the gold and silver, but the true treasure is knowledge, the connection to those who came before us, their stories preserved against impossible odds. If I don't live to see this through, I leave this legacy in Margaret's capable hands. She has always understood that some things are worth believing in, even when others see only worthless swampland. As tears blurred her vision, Margaret closed the journal gently. Outside, floodlights illuminated dozens of archaeologists working late into the night, carefully recovering history piece by precious piece from the mud. The Santa Isabella's secrets were emerging daily, each artifact telling part of a story 3 centuries in the making. Margaret Wilson, once ridiculed for holding onto worthless land, was now celebrated as the guardian of an irreplaceable historical treasure. The widow who had inherited a swamp had discovered not just material wealth, but something far more valuable: the fulfillment of a dream, the validation of faith, and a legacy that would outlive them all. In the end, the true treasure wasn't gold or silver, it was Thomas Wilson's unwavering belief in his wife's determination to honor it, even when everyone else saw only worthless mud. Some treasures, it seems, are visible only to those who look beyond the surface, who maintain faith when others see only folly. For Margaret Wilson, that persistence had uncovered not just a Spanish galleon, but the priceless reward of vindication. The media frenzy surrounding the Santa Isabella discovery transformed sleepy Blackwater, Florida into an international destination practically overnight. 6 weeks after the initial press conference, Margaret Wilson found herself navigating a changed reality. Her private driveway now featured security checkpoints, while an ever-growing team of archaeologists, conservators, and specialists worked in shifts around the specialized excavation site. "We've established a proper cofferdam around the entire vessel," Dr. Vasquez explained as she guided Margaret through the bustling operation. This allows us to control moisture levels precisely, preventing damage that could occur if the timbers dried too quickly after centuries underwater. The excavation site resembled a bizarre hybrid between a construction zone and a surgical theater. Heavy machinery stood alongside delicate hand tools, while researchers in specialized protective gear moved with reverent care around the exposed portions of the Galleon. Yesterday's imaging revealed intact cargo holds, Dr. Vasquez continued, pointing to a digital rendering on her tablet. The preservation is unprecedented, even organic materials like textiles and paper documents appear stable in the anaerobic environment. Margaret studied the detailed scan with wonderment. Thomas would have been fascinated by the technology. He did all his research with paper maps and metal detectors. The archaeologist smiled. Yet he found what advanced scientific teams missed for centuries. Never underestimate good old-fashioned determination. As they spoke, a conservation specialist approached with evident excitement. Dr. Vasquez, we've just extracted the captain's personal chest from the officers' quarters. The contents appear remarkably intact. Moments later, Margaret found herself watching as white-glove specialists carefully opened an ornate wooden chest for the first time in 308 years. Inside lay a treasure not of gold or silver, but of history, leather-bound logbooks, navigational instruments, personal correspondence, and small devotional items. "This is extraordinary," whispered Dr. Vasquez, her professional detachment momentarily forgotten as she delicately lifted a sealed packet of letters. These could provide first-hand accounts of the hurricane that claimed the fleet. For Margaret, watching these intimate possessions emerge from their centuries-long slumber evoked complex emotions. She imagined the captain writing in these journals, handling these instruments, perhaps praying with these religious medallions as his ship fought the monstrous storm that would ultimately entomb it. "It feels almost intrusive," she admitted softly. "Like reading someone's diary without permission." Dr. Vasquez nodded understandingly. "That's the ethical paradox of archaeology. We're essentially intruding on private lives long past, yet doing so preserves their stories when they would otherwise be lost forever." Later that evening, as Margaret returned to the cabin, she found an unfamiliar luxury sedan parked in her driveway. A distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit stood on her porch, his posture suggesting accustomed authority. "Mrs. Wilson," he inquired as she approached. "I'm Richard Blackwood, representing Oceanic Salvage International. We specialize in high-value shipwreck recovery." Margaret maintained a neutral expression. "I'm aware of your company, Mr. Blackwood. You were involved in the controversial recovery of the San Miguel artifacts in 2019. The man's smile faltered slightly. "An unfortunate misunderstanding with the Colombian government. But I'm here to discuss a much more straightforward proposition. My company is prepared to offer you $50 million for exclusive salvage rights to the Santa Isabella." "The excavation is already underway," Margaret replied calmly, "under university supervision." "Academic excavations are notoriously slow and inefficient," Blackwood countered smoothly. "Our team could recover the valuable cargo within weeks, rather than the years Dr. Vasquez's approach will require. You'd receive immediate compensation rather than waiting indefinitely." Margaret studied the man carefully. "And what about the historical context? The documentation? The ship itself?" Blackwood made a dismissive gesture. "We'd preserve anything of genuine historical significance, of course. But let's be honest, the primary value lies in the precious metals and gemstones." "I disagree," Margaret replied firmly. "The primary value lies in the complete historical record, the human story preserved within that vessel. My husband dedicated his life to finding that story, not simply extracting gold and silver." "Mrs. Wilson," Blackwood's tone grew more insistent, "the offer I'm making represents immediate financial security. Academic partnerships offer prestige, certainly, but little practical benefit. $50 million could transform your life." Margaret's expression hardened. "Mr. Blackwood, my life was transformed the moment I honored my husband's belief instead of selling this worthless land. I'm not interested in shortcuts that compromise the integrity of his legacy." The man's cordial facade briefly slipped. The Spanish government's claim will eventually be upheld in international courts. When that happens, you'll receive nothing. This offer represents your only opportunity for significant compensation. Perhaps, Margaret acknowledged. But some things are worth more than money. Good evening, Mr. Blackwood. As the salvage executive's car disappeared down the rural road, Margaret reflected on how differently this conversation might have gone 6 months earlier, when medical bills and property taxes had seemed insurmountable obstacles. Now she found herself in the unusual position of rejecting $50 million on principle, a luxury she recognized few would understand. Yet she knew with absolute certainty that Thomas would have made the same decision without hesitation. The following morning brought a new development. Dr. Vasquez arrived earlier than usual, her expression troubled as she requested a private conversation. "There's been a development with the Spanish claim," she explained once they were seated in the cabin's small kitchen. "Their cultural minister is flying in tomorrow for direct negotiations. They're bringing significant political pressure to bear through diplomatic channels." Margaret sighed. Thomas predicted this in his notes. "What are our options?" "Legally, your position remains strong," the archaeologist replied. "American courts have generally upheld private property rights in similar cases, especially for shipwrecks found on land rather than in navigable waters. But litigation could drag on for years, potentially halting the excavation entirely." "That's unacceptable," Margaret stated firmly. "Every day the site remains exposed increases risk to the artifacts. We can't afford years of legal battles while the ship deteriorates." Dr. Vasquez nodded. "There may be another approach." Thomas mentioned in his research notes a Spanish royal decree from 1776 regarding salvage rights for vessels lost in the Americas. "I've been researching it, and it could potentially offer a compromise framework." Margaret retrieved Thomas's filing system, locating the relevant documents within minutes. Together they studied his meticulous notes on Spanish maritime law, identifying potential avenues for negotiation that might satisfy both national pride and archaeological integrity. By the time Cultural Minister Elena Castellanos arrived the following day, Margaret had prepared a comprehensive proposal. Rather than meeting in government offices or corporate boardrooms, she invited the Spanish delegation to the excavation site itself, where the tangible reality of the discovery could inform their discussions. Minister Castellanos, an elegant woman in her 60s with a background in art history before entering politics, listened attentively as Dr. Vasquez provided a detailed tour of the ongoing work. Margaret observed the Spanish official's genuine wonder as she witnessed conservators extracting a perfectly preserved navigational astrolabe bearing the Spanish royal seal. "Remarkable preservation," the minister commented, her academic interest temporarily overriding diplomatic posturing. "These artifacts would deteriorate rapidly if removed hastily." "Precisely our concern," Margaret agreed, sensing an opening. "Which is why I'd like to propose a collaborative approach rather than an adversarial one." Over the next several hours, seated at a makeshift conference table overlooking the excavation, they outlined a framework that would acknowledge Spain's historical connection while respecting Margaret's property rights. The resulting agreement, while complex, established principles that would guide the recovery process. The University of Florida would maintain primary excavation authority, ensuring proper archaeological methods. Spain would provide additional funding and expert conservators specializing in colonial maritime artifacts. Recovered treasure would be divided, with 30% returning to Spain for museum display, 50% remaining under Margaret's ownership, and 20% funding ongoing conservation of all recovered materials. Most importantly, the complete collection would initially be exhibited together as a unified discovery before any division occurred, ensuring the historical context remained intact. "My government will need to review the specifics," Minister Castellanos noted as their discussion concluded, "but I believe this framework honors both Spain's heritage and your husband's remarkable achievement." As they sealed their tentative agreement with a handshake, Margaret felt a weight lifting. Thomas had anticipated this challenge, preparing for it through years of research into maritime law and historical precedent. Once again, his foresight had provided a path forward. What neither Margaret nor the archaeological team could have anticipated, however, was the discovery made 3 days later in the captain's private quarters. Dr. Vasquez arrived at the cabin well after midnight, her expression a mixture of excitement and concern. "We found something extraordinary," she explained breathlessly. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew about the Santa Isabella's mission." In the secure conservation tent, Margaret stared in astonishment at the documents carefully arranged on the examination table, a leather portfolio containing papers bearing the royal seal of Spain, their contents protected by waterproof oilskin wrappings. "These are diplomatic communiques," Dr. Vasquez explained, pointing to specific passages in the meticulously preserved documents. "Secret correspondence between the Spanish crown and representatives in the American colonies. But it's the date that makes this exceptional, 1715, a full 60 years before the American Revolution." "What are they discussing?" Margaret asked, sensing the historian's barely contained excitement. "Potential Spanish support for colonial independence from Britain," Dr. Vasquez replied. "These documents suggest Spain was considering strategic relationships with colonial leaders decades before the revolution actually occurred." The implications were staggering. If authentic, these papers could rewrite understanding of early American history and Spain's role in the eventual independence movement. "The captain must have been transporting these sensitive documents when the hurricane struck," Dr. Vasquez continued. "Which explains why no record of them exists in Spanish archives. They were never delivered." Margaret considered this revelation carefully. "This could complicate our agreement with Minister Castellanos." "Considerably," the archaeologist agreed. "These aren't simply treasure or artifacts, they're historically sensitive diplomatic documents that could affect how we understand the foundations of American independence." After careful consideration, Margaret made a decision consistent with her commitment to historical truth over personal advantage. The following morning, she personally contacted Minister Castellanos to inform her of the discovery before any public announcement could be made. The Spanish official's response was measured but appreciative of the transparency. "These documents will require careful diplomatic handling," she acknowledged. "But your honesty in bringing them directly to our attention speaks volumes, Mrs. Wilson. It reinforces my confidence in our partnership." Over the subsequent weeks, as news of the diplomatic documents spread through academic circles, Margaret found herself at the center of escalating interest from unexpected quarters. Historians specializing in Revolutionary America began arriving in Blackwater, while the Smithsonian Institution and Library of Congress sent representatives to discuss the document's significance. The discovery had transcended mere treasure hunting to become something far more valuable, a window into a hidden chapter of history, a perspective-altering glimpse of international relations that had shaped the modern world in ways previously unrecognized. For months after the initial discovery, the first major artifacts were ready for public display. Rather than separating the collection immediately, Margaret had insisted on a unified exhibition that told the complete story of the Santa Isabella, from its construction in Spanish shipyards to its final journey and the remarkable circumstances of its rediscovery. The exhibition opened first at the Florida State Museum before its scheduled international tour. On opening night, Margaret stood quietly at the back of the crowded gallery, watching visitors move with reverent fascination between displays of gleaming silver coins, navigational instruments, personal possessions, and the diplomatic documents that had rewritten historical understanding. "Your husband would be proud," Dr. Vasquez said softly, joining her in observation. "This is exactly what he hoped for, not just the discovery itself, but the knowledge it brings to light." Margaret nodded, emotion momentarily preventing speech. In a nearby display case, alongside the ship's artifacts, sat Thomas's original research journals. Her insistence on including them as part of the exhibition had initially puzzled curators, until she explained their importance. The Santa Isabella remained hidden for over 3 centuries, she had told them. Understanding how one ordinary man with extraordinary persistence ultimately found it is as important as the shipwreck itself. Now, watching visitors pore over Thomas's meticulous notes with the same interest they showed the Spanish treasures, she felt a profound sense of completion. The worthless Swampland had yielded not only material wealth but intellectual riches beyond calculation. 6 months into the excavation, with approximately 40% of the ship's contents carefully documented and preserved, a new challenge emerged from an unexpected direction. The Blackwater County Council, previously eager to purchase Margaret's land at bargain prices, now pursued a different approach. They're attempting to rezone the entire area as a historical preservation district, her attorney explained during an emergency meeting, which would give them regulatory authority over the excavation and any future development of the property. Margaret frowned. Can they do that retroactively, after the discovery is already underway? They're arguing that the historical significance justifies extraordinary measures, the lawyer replied. It's a transparent attempt to gain control now that the property's value has been established, but they're couching it in language about protecting historical resources for public benefit. This new challenge required a different approach than international diplomacy. After consulting with her legal team, Margaret decided to address the county council directly at their next public meeting. The council chambers were packed when Margaret rose to speak, many attendees wearing newly printed T-shirts featuring images of the Santa Isabella, evidence of how thoroughly the discovery had been embraced by the local community. For 30 years, she began, her voice steady despite her discomfort with public speaking, my husband Thomas Wilson paid property taxes on land this very council repeatedly described as worthless. He maintained it at his own expense, researched its history without grants or public funding, and was frequently ridiculed for his belief in its significance. She paused, making eye contact with council members who had shifted uncomfortably at this reminder. 6 months ago, when I was recently widowed and struggling financially, this council offered me $175,000 for the property, approximately 1/10 of its actual market value even before the discovery. Now that its true significance has been revealed, you seek to control it through regulatory means after decades of disinterest. Murmurs rippled through the audience as Margaret continued. I understand the desire to ensure this remarkable discovery benefits the community. I share that goal. That's why I've already established the Thomas Wilson Historical Foundation, which will oversee a permanent museum and research center on the property, ensuring public access to this historical treasure in perpetuity. She unveiled architectural renderings of the proposed facility, a project she had been developing quietly with Dr. Vasquez and university partners. This foundation will provide educational opportunities, tourism development, and scholarly research facilities that will benefit Blackwater far more than county ownership ever could. It will operate as a non-profit entity with a board that includes community representatives, ensuring local interests are always considered. The council president leaned forward. And the considerable financial proceeds from the recovered treasure? Margaret had anticipated this question. 30% of all recovered valuables will fund the foundation's operations permanently, creating dozens of local jobs and educational opportunities. An additional 15% will establish a community development fund specifically for Blackwater infrastructure and educational programs. She allowed herself a small smile. All of which will generate significantly more economic benefit than property taxes on worthless swampland. The proposed foundation represented everything Thomas would have wanted: preservation of the discovery's integrity, educational opportunities for future generations, and protection from exploitation by either governmental or commercial interests. It transformed what could have been merely a personal windfall into a lasting legacy. 2 weeks later, the county council unanimously approved Margaret's foundation proposal, abandoning their rezoning attempt in favor of partnership with the new institution. Construction began immediately on the research facility, with temporary exhibition spaces open to accommodate growing public interest. As summer turned to fall, a full year after the storm that had revealed the ship's remains, Margaret stood at the observation platform overlooking the excavation site. The Santa Isabella was now fully visible, its remarkable preservation drawing gasps from visitors who came by the thousands. We've only scratched the surface of what this discovery will teach us, Dr. Vasquez remarked, joining Margaret at the railing. The historical implications continue to expand as we analyze the documents and artifacts. Margaret nodded, thinking of how a discovery initially valued for its gold and silver had proven infinitely more precious for its historical insights. The diplomatic documents alone had spawned dozens of academic papers re-examining early colonial relationships, while the perfectly preserved everyday items from the ship provided unprecedented glimpses into 18th-century maritime life. Thomas always said the real value wasn't the treasure itself, she reflected. It was the knowledge that had been lost to time. As twilight settled over the excavation site, Margaret walked alone to the small memorial she had created at the edge of the property, a simple stone bench overlooking both the Santa Isabella and the swamp that had protected it for centuries. A small plaque bore Thomas's favorite quote from his beloved historical texts: "The past is never lost to those with patience to seek it." Here, in the gathering darkness, she felt closest to her late husband, surrounded by the tangible proof of his lifelong conviction that value exists where others see only worthlessness, that persistence eventually vindicates faith, and that the most important discoveries often lie beneath the surface of what we think we know. The worthless swampland had yielded treasure beyond imagination, not just in precious metals and gemstones, but in historical understanding, in vindication of unwavering belief, and in the profound satisfaction of proving that sometimes, the most valuable insights come from those willing to look where others refuse to see. The international media spotlight cast upon Blackwater, Florida had grown from occasional news stories to a constant presence. 18 months after the Santa Isabella's discovery, the excavation had evolved into a sophisticated archaeological operation attracting researchers from 27 countries. What had begun as Margaret Wilson's private inheritance had transformed into a global historical phenomenon, drawing over 30,000 visitors monthly to the observation platforms surrounding the carefully protected site. "We've recovered approximately 65% of the cargo and artifacts," Dr. Vasquez reported during their weekly status meeting. They sat in the newly completed conference room of the Thomas Wilson Historical Foundation headquarters, a striking modern building designed to complement rather than overshadow the natural environment of the property. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, they could observe teams of conservators working inside climate-controlled structures built around portions of the Spanish Galleon. The ship itself remained partially embedded in the land, protected by sophisticated engineering that maintained optimal preservation conditions. "The conservation challenges remain unprecedented," Dr. Vasquez continued, scrolling through detailed reports on her tablet. "We're literally writing new chapters in archaeological preservation methods. 3 universities have established graduate programs specifically focused on the techniques we're developing here." Margaret nodded, still sometimes overwhelmed by the scope of what Thomas's persistence had unleashed. "And the documentary evidence continues to yield remarkable insights." The archaeologist's face brightened with scholarly enthusiasm. "The diplomatic papers alone have spawned 14 doctoral dissertations examining previously unknown Spanish involvement in pre-revolutionary America." Their discussion was interrupted by Margaret's assistant, a local historian whom she'd hired to help manage the foundation's growing responsibilities. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Secretary Martinez has arrived for his tour." Margaret glanced at her watch with surprise. "He's 40 minutes early." Apparently he was eager to see the site before the formal reception, her assistant explained apologetically. Within minutes, Margaret found herself greeting the United States Secretary of the Interior, who had arrived with minimal entourage, just 2 aides and necessary security personnel. "Mrs. Wilson," Secretary Martinez smiled warmly, extending his hand. "I've been following the Santa Isabella project since its discovery. What you've accomplished here is nothing short of revolutionary for American heritage preservation." "My husband deserves the credit," Margaret replied modestly. "I'm simply ensuring his vision is properly implemented." As they walked the elevated pathways providing views of different excavation areas, Secretary Martinez asked detailed, knowledgeable questions that revealed genuine interest beyond political courtesy. His background in environmental conservation before entering politics gave him particular appreciation for the ecological care being taken during the archaeological work. "The integration of preservation with education is particularly impressive," he observed, noting the university students working alongside senior archaeologists. "You've created a living classroom." "That was always Thomas's dream," Margaret explained. "He taught high school history for 35 years. Even as treasure hunting was fundamentally about education, about connecting people with tangible evidence of the past. At the main conservation pavilion, they paused to observe technicians carefully cleaning a recently recovered navigational instrument. Through specialized glass that protected the artifact from harmful light while allowing visitor observation, they watched the painstaking process of removing centuries of sediment without damaging the original materials. Mrs. Wilson, Secretary Martinez said thoughtfully, "I believe this site represents a unique opportunity to establish new standards for archaeological preservation. With your permission, I'd like to propose the Santa Isabella excavation as a National Heritage Priority Project." Margaret regarded him carefully. What exactly would that entail? Substantial federal resources, for one thing, he replied. Additional funding, specialized equipment, expanded security. But more importantly, it would establish what you've created here as a model for future discoveries, the gold standard for balancing archaeological integrity with public access and educational opportunity. While maintaining the Foundation's independent governance, Margaret clarified, her tone making it clear this wasn't a question but a requirement. Secretary Martinez nodded. Absolutely. Your leadership has proven remarkably effective. This wouldn't be a federal takeover, but a supportive partnership. By the time the formal reception began that evening in the Foundation's grand atrium, word of the Secretary's interest had spread through the archaeological team. The atmosphere was electric with possibility as researchers, conservators, local officials, and Foundation board members mingled over champagne and locally catered refreshments. Margaret, never entirely comfortable in such social settings, found a quiet moment to step onto the atrium's balcony overlooking the illuminated excavation site. In the evening light, with specialized conservation tents glowing softly against the darkening sky, the scene resembled a mysterious village of light, a fitting metaphor for the illumination this discovery had brought to history's shadows. "Quite a view," observed an unfamiliar voice behind her. Margaret turned to find an elderly gentleman in a well-worn tweed jacket, his academic demeanor contrasting sharply with the formal attire of most attendees. Dr. James Harrington, he introduced himself with a slight bow. University of Edinburgh, Maritime History. I hope you don't mind an uninvited guest. I've been corresponding with Dr. Vasquez for months, and when I found myself in Florida. Any colleague of Dr. Vasquez is welcome here, Margaret assured him, immediately warming to his unpretentious manner. Are you consulting on a specific aspect of the excavation? Actually, I've been researching the Santa Isabella's sister ship, the San Rafael, he explained. They were constructed in the same shipyard within months of each other. The San Rafael completed her final voyage successfully, which provides valuable comparative context for understanding the Santa Isabella's construction and cargo. As they discussed the historical connections between the vessels, Margaret was struck by how effortlessly she now conversed about 18th-century Spanish shipbuilding techniques and colonial trade patterns, subjects that would have been completely foreign to her 2 years earlier. Thomas's passion had become her own, not through deliberate study but through daily immersion in the world his discovery had revealed. His journals, once filled with terminology she struggled to comprehend, now seemed like familiar correspondence from a kindred spirit. Mrs. Wilson, Dr. Harrington said after a thoughtful pause in their conversation, may I share an observation? I've visited many significant excavations throughout my career, but never one with such harmonious integration of scientific rigor, public education, and respect for historical context. You've achieved something quite remarkable here. I had excellent guidance, Margaret replied, thinking of Thomas's detailed contingency plans and ethical frameworks established long before the discovery itself. Indeed, but guidance alone doesn't guarantee wisdom in implementation, the historian noted. Many discoveries of this magnitude devolve into academic territorialism or commercial exploitation. You've navigated treacherous waters with remarkable skill for someone thrust unexpectedly into this position. His words touched Margaret deeply, acknowledging the challenging journey she had undertaken since that stormy night when the swamp had first revealed its secret. She had been transformed as surely as the landscape itself, from a grieving widow facing financial uncertainty to the steward of an internationally significant historical discovery. Later that evening, as the reception concluded, Secretary Martinez approached with a more formal proposal. The Department of Interior was prepared to designate the Santa Isabella site as a National Historical Landmark, with special provisions maintaining the Thomas Wilson Foundation's governance while providing significant federal resources for ongoing preservation and research. This approach preserves your husband's legacy while ensuring the discovery's long-term protection, he explained. The designation carries significant prestige but, more importantly, provides access to specialized conservation resources unavailable elsewhere. After consulting with her board and legal advisors, Margaret accepted the designation, with carefully negotiated conditions ensuring the Foundation's continued autonomy and adherence to Thomas's original vision for the site. The following morning brought unexpected visitors, representatives from the Museum of the Americas in Madrid, including the institution's director, Dr. Alejandro Calderon. "We've been following the recovery with great interest," Dr. Calderon explained after introductions. "Particularly the remarkable preservation of textiles and paper materials, which surpasses anything previously recovered from colonial-era shipwrecks." Their visit had been prompted by a recent discovery within the Santa Isabella's cargo hold, a sealed lead container protecting what appeared to be original architectural plans for several important colonial structures, including churches and government buildings in New Spain. These documents, if fully restored and authenticated, would fill significant gaps in understanding Spanish colonial architecture. "These would be centerpieces of our colonial America collection," Dr. Calderon acknowledged, "but we recognize the complexity of the situation. Rather than pursuing ownership claims, we propose a collaborative restoration and study program." The Spanish Museum offered to send their world-renowned paper conservation team to work on-site at the Foundation, bringing specialized equipment and expertise unavailable elsewhere. In exchange, they requested that the architectural documents eventually tour Spanish museums after complete documentation and study. "This approach honors both Spanish heritage and American discovery rights," Dr. Calderon suggested. "A model of international cooperation rather than ownership disputes." Margaret readily agreed, recognizing the proposal's alignment with Thomas's belief that historical knowledge should transcend national boundaries. This partnership represented exactly the type of collaborative approach he had advocated in his journals, prioritizing preservation and knowledge over possessive nationalism. 2 years after the discovery, as autumn painted Florida's landscape with subtle shifts of color, Margaret sat with Dr. Vasquez reviewing plans for the next phase of the excavation. The academic had become not just a professional colleague but a trusted friend, one of the few people who truly understood the weight of responsibility Margaret carried. "We're approaching a critical decision point," Dr. Vasquez explained, indicating detailed structural analyses of the ship's remaining buried sections. "The hull's integrity is remarkable considering its age, but the exposure to environmental changes is creating stress on the lower portions. We need to decide whether to extract the entire vessel for controlled conservation or continue in situ preservation." Either approach carried significant risks and benefits. Complete extraction would allow more thorough documentation and preservation but risked catastrophic damage during the process. Continuing in-place conservation maintained the contextual environment but limited access to lower sections potentially containing significant artifacts. What would Thomas have prioritized? Dr. Vasquez asked gently. Margaret considered the question carefully, thinking back to countless evenings when Thomas had returned from exploring the swamp, his clothes mud-stained but his eyes alight with possibility. He had never seen the ship with his physical eyes, yet had understood its significance more completely than anyone. Thomas would say the ship's story matters more than its physical preservation, she finally answered. He believed context was everything, that artifacts separated from their environment lost essential meaning. This philosophical foundation guided their ultimate decision, to maintain the Santa Isabella in its discovered position, creating a permanent preservation structure that would protect it while allowing ongoing research. Rather than removing the ship from the environment that had preserved it for centuries, they would adapt modern technology to that environment. The resulting design, developed by architectural conservationists from 3 countries, became known as the Wilson approach in archaeological circles, a methodology prioritizing contextual preservation over extraction whenever technically feasible. As construction began on the permanent conservation structure, a sophisticated facility integrating cutting-edge preservation technology with educational spaces, Margaret received unexpected news from her attorneys regarding the treasure's legal status. The complex agreement dividing recovered valuables between Spanish cultural institutions, the Foundation, and Margaret's personal ownership had been formally recognized by international courts, establishing a precedent for future archaeological discoveries of similar complexity. After accounting for conservation costs, Foundation endowment, and the agreed portions returning to Spain, Margaret's personal share of the treasure's value exceeded $85 million. The funds will be available once the final valuation is complete, her financial advisor explained during a private meeting. We should discuss investment strategies for managing such significant assets. Margaret nodded absently, her thoughts elsewhere. The financial windfall, while substantial, seemed almost incidental to the discovery's true significance. She had witnessed historians weep with emotion while handling perfectly preserved letters that filled gaps in understanding colonial life. She had seen schoolchildren's faces illuminate with wonder as they grasped historical connections for the first time. These moments carried value no monetary figure could represent. Actually, she replied after a thoughtful pause, I'd like to discuss establishing a new initiative. The Thomas Wilson Educational Trust. By that evening, she had outlined a program that would ultimately transform her personal financial gain into something Thomas would have valued far more, an educational endowment providing college scholarships for students pursuing careers in history, archaeology, and conservation. With particular emphasis on supporting students from disadvantaged backgrounds, the program embodied Thomas's belief that historical knowledge should be accessible to all, not just academic elites. As the third anniversary of the discovery approached, Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to the small memorial bench she had created at the property's edge, a quiet space for reflection amid the now constant activity surrounding the excavation. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, she discovered she wasn't alone in seeking this tranquil corner. A teenage girl sat on the bench, sketching in a well-worn notebook. She looked up with embarrassment when she noticed Margaret's approach. I'm sorry, she said quickly, closing her sketchbook. I know this area is probably private. It's perfectly fine, Margaret assured her, taking a seat at the opposite end of the bench. I'm Margaret Wilson. I know, the girl replied, her expression shifting to one of awkward recognition. I'm Sophia. My mom works in the conservation lab, she's a textiles specialist. Sometimes I come with her after school. Margaret nodded toward the sketchbook. May I see what you're drawing? With hesitant pride, Sophia revealed detailed sketches of the Santa Isabella's ornate stern castle, capturing the intricate carvings that had somehow survived centuries buried in mud. These are remarkably accurate, Margaret observed, genuinely impressed by the technical skill evident in the drawings. Have you been sketching long? Since I was little, Sophia replied, gaining confidence. I used to think I wanted to be an artist, but since Mom started working here. She gestured toward the excavation site. Now I'm thinking about archaeological illustration. Combining art with history, you know? Margaret smiled, recognizing in this young woman's enthusiasm the same spark that had driven Thomas through decades of determined research. Your mother must be Dr. Rivera? Her work on the sail fragments has been groundbreaking. Sophia nodded proudly. She says this project changed everything, not just for archaeology, but for her career. We moved here from Miami after her contract position ended at the university. Now she has permanent funding and gets to do what she loves every day. Their conversation continued as twilight deepened, the teenager sharing her observations about the excavation with surprising insight. Margaret found herself enjoying the fresh perspective, seeing the project through young eyes unclouded by academic politics or funding concerns. Can I ask you something? Sophia ventured eventually. Everyone talks about how amazing it was that your husband figured out the ship was here, but nobody really explains how. Was he psychic or something? Margaret laughed softly. Nothing supernatural, though it seemed that way sometimes. Thomas simply paid attention to things others overlooked. He studied historical maps showing how dramatically the coastline had changed. He analyzed soil samples finding trace minerals consistent with deteriorated metals. But mostly, he refused to accept conventional wisdom that nothing valuable could exist in a place everyone called worthless. That's even cooler than being psychic, Sophia decided after consideration. Anyone can have a lucky guess, but proving everyone wrong through research and hard work? That's actually inspiring. As darkness settled completely over the swamp, now transformed into a world-class archaeological site, Margaret reflected on the unexpected ripples continuing to spread from Thomas's discovery. Not just the historical knowledge gained or academic advancements made, but personal impacts on countless individuals, the conservators developing pioneering techniques, the doctoral students building careers on newly discovered primary sources, and young people like Sophia finding inspiration for their own futures. The worthless swampland had yielded treasures far beyond gold doubloons and silver ingots. It had created a living legacy of knowledge, opportunity, and inspiration, precisely what Thomas would have valued most. The following morning brought news that the final major section of the ship's cargo hold had been successfully accessed, revealing an astonishing find: the captain's personal strongbox containing not only valuables but his confidential orders from the Spanish crown. These documents promised to shed new light on Spain's complex relationship with its colonies during a pivotal historical period. As Margaret observed the conservators carefully extracting these priceless papers, she felt Thomas's presence more strongly than ever. Not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as a continuing influence, his methodical approach, his ethical framework, his unwavering belief in the value of historical knowledge guiding every decision she made. 3 years earlier, she had been a grieving widow facing financial uncertainty, inheriting land everyone considered worthless. Now she stood at the center of one of history's most significant archaeological discoveries, not through luck or circumstance, but through honoring a vision others had dismissed as foolish obsession. The true treasure, Margaret had come to understand, lay not in the millions of dollars of recovered gold and silver, but in the vindication of unwavering belief, in the profound satisfaction of proving that value exists where others see only worthlessness, that persistence eventually overcomes skepticism, and that sometimes the greatest discoveries come only after decades of faith in possibilities others cannot see. As specialists carefully documented each new artifact emerging from the Santa Isabella's final compartments, Margaret stepped outside to gaze across the transformed landscape. Where stagnant water and tangled vegetation had once dominated, now stood world-class research facilities, educational exhibits, and conservation laboratories, physical manifestations of Thomas's intellectual legacy. Yet beyond these tangible achievements lay something even more valuable: the countless minds expanded, careers launched, and young imaginations inspired by what one ordinary man with extraordinary persistence had accomplished. Thomas Wilson had never lived to see his theories validated, but his impact would continue for generations through the discovery that had transformed not just a worthless swamp, but understanding of history itself. The sunken galleon had remained hidden for over 3 centuries, patiently waiting for someone who could look beyond the surface, who could envision possibility where others saw only mud and mosquitoes. In the end, its discovery had revealed a truth far more valuable than its cargo: that our greatest limitations are often not external obstacles but our own willingness to accept conventional wisdom about what is possible and what is worthless. For Margaret Wilson, this understanding represented the greatest treasure of all, one that no court could divide, no museum could display, yet whose value would continue appreciating through every life touched by the remarkable story of determination, faith, and vindication that had begun with a storm revealing what lay beneath the surface of a supposedly worthless Florida swamp. 5 years to the day after the storm that had exposed the Santa Isabella, Margaret Wilson stood at the entrance of the newly completed Santa Isabella Visitor Center, watching as final preparations were made for its grand opening ceremony. The sleek, contemporary building represented the culmination of years of planning, a permanent facility designed to showcase the discovery's significance while protecting its fragile remains for generations to come. The governor's motorcade just passed the county line, her assistant reported, checking messages on her tablet. They should arrive in approximately 20 minutes. Margaret nodded, her attention drawn to a group of schoolchildren already gathered at the entrance, their excitement palpable even from a distance. The center wouldn't officially open until tomorrow, but she had arranged for students from Thomas's former high school to receive a private preview immediately following today's ceremony. "Is everything ready in the exhibition hall?" she asked Dr. Vasquez, who approached with clipboard in hand. "Perfect timing," the archaeologist smiled. "The final display case was sealed 10 minutes ago. The environmental controls are fully operational and all interactive elements have been tested." Together they walked through the center's soaring main atrium, where natural light filtered through specially designed windows that eliminated harmful UV rays while illuminating the space with a warm glow. The building itself had become an architectural award winner, its design seamlessly integrating with the surrounding landscape while incorporating cutting-edge conservation technology. The main exhibition space featured a spectacular central display, a perfect 1/10 scale model of the Santa Isabella suspended above visitors' heads, showing both the vessel's original appearance and its condition when discovered. Surrounding this centerpiece were thematically organized exhibits examining different aspects of the ship's history, cargo, and significance. Most impressive was the direct viewing area, a specialized chamber where visitors could observe portions of the actual shipwreck through protective glass. Advanced environmental controls maintain precise temperature, humidity, and lighting conditions to prevent deterioration while allowing public viewing of this archaeological treasure. "The holographic reconstruction is particularly effective," Dr. Vasquez noted as they continued their tour, indicating an interactive display where visitors could use gesture controls to rebuild the ship virtually, seeing how each recovered fragment had originally fit within the vessel's structure. Margaret paused at a display dedicated to Thomas Wilson's research, his journals, maps, and field equipment preserved behind glass alongside photographs documenting his decades-long investigation. The exhibit's title, Persistence, One Man's Search for Historical Truth, captured precisely what she had hoped to convey about his legacy. "He would have been overwhelmed by all this," she observed softly. Dr. Vasquez nodded understanding. "Yet everything here reflects his vision, the integration of historical context, the educational focus, the accessibility to people of all backgrounds. The methods may be more sophisticated than he imagined, but the purpose remains exactly what he intended." Outside, the ceremony preparations were complete. A stage had been erected facing the center's entrance, with seating for distinguished guests, project partners, and media representatives. Behind these formal arrangements, space had been allocated for community members, hundreds of Blackwater residents who had witnessed their small town's transformation from an overlooked backwater to an internationally significant historical site. The governor arrived precisely on schedule, accompanied by the Spanish ambassador, representatives from participating universities, and federal officials including Secretary Martinez, who had become a steadfast advocate for the project. Formal introductions and pleasantries were exchanged before Margaret was ushered to her position for the opening ceremony. As she took her place on the stage, gazing out at the assembled crowd, Margaret was struck by the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The path from grieving widow facing financial hardship to steward of a global historical treasure had been neither straight nor easy, yet each challenge had ultimately strengthened her commitment to honoring Thomas's vision. The ceremony proceeded with formal speeches highlighting the discovery's historical significance, the unprecedented preservation methods developed, and the international cooperation that had made the project possible. When Margaret's turn came to address the gathering, she approached the podium with characteristic modesty. 5 years ago, she began, a storm revealed what everyone, including myself, had dismissed as worthless swampland. Today we celebrate not just the archaeological treasure uncovered, but the power of unwavering belief in possibilities others cannot see. She spoke briefly but powerfully about Thomas's decades of determination, the countless weekends spent trudging through mud when others mocked his obsession, and the profound satisfaction she wished he could have experienced seeing his theories vindicated. "The true legacy of the Santa Isabella discovery isn't measured in gold or silver," she concluded, "but in expanded human knowledge, in educational opportunities created, and in the reminder that sometimes our greatest discoveries lie just beneath the surface of what we've dismissed as worthless." As the ceremonial ribbon was cut and applause swept through the crowd, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion, not an ending, but the fulfillment of a promise made to Thomas's memory that his life's work would be properly honored. The remainder of the day passed in a blur of interviews, guided tours for dignitaries, and conversations with project partners. By late afternoon, as the official guests departed, Margaret welcomed the group she had been most anticipating, 30 students from Blackwater High School, where Thomas had taught history for over 3 decades before his retirement. Mrs. Wilson, their teacher, introduced himself. "I actually had your husband as my history teacher my junior year. He's the reason I became a teacher myself." This connection touched Margaret deeply. Thomas would have been so pleased to know that. "He changed how I saw the world," the teacher continued. "He made history feel immediate and relevant, not just dates and facts." These students have been studying the Santa Isabella discovery all semester as part of our local history curriculum. Margaret personally guided the group through the exhibition, delighting in their genuine curiosity and insightful questions. These teenagers, many from families who had lived in Blackwater for generations, understood the discovery's significance in ways outside visitors often missed. They recognized how it had transformed not just historical understanding but their community's identity and economic prospects. One girl hung back as the group moved between exhibits, studying Thomas's research journals with particular intensity. Margaret approached her quietly. "Something specific caught your interest?" The student looked up, momentarily startled. "Sorry, I was just looking at his notes about the coastline changes. My grandfather used to fish these waters, and he always said the land was different in his grandfather's day. Everyone thought he was just telling stories, but..." She gestured toward the geological survey maps Thomas had collected. He was right. Thomas believed deeply in listening to local knowledge. Margaret smiled. He often said academic experts miss insights that people with generational connections to a place take for granted. The girl nodded thoughtfully. "I'm doing my senior project on how the Santa Isabella discovery has changed archaeological methods. Dr. Vasquez has been helping me with research." Margaret recognized Sophia, the teenage daughter of the textiles specialist she had met years earlier, now transformed into a poised young woman on the cusp of college. "How are your archaeological illustrations coming along?" Sophia's expression brightened with pleased surprise. "You remembered. I'm actually starting at the University of Florida next fall, dual major in archaeological science and scientific illustration. I got one of the Thomas Wilson scholarships." This news brought Margaret unexpected joy, tangible evidence that the educational trust established in Thomas's name was already nurturing the next generation of historical researchers. What began as one man's solitary obsession had expanded into a living legacy of knowledge and opportunity. That evening, after all visitors had departed and the center stood quiet in anticipation of tomorrow's public opening, Margaret returned alone to the memorial bench at the property's edge. The transformation of the surrounding landscape was remarkable, from overgrown swamp to world-class research facility, yet this small corner remained intentionally unchanged, preserving the natural environment Thomas had found so compelling. From this vantage point, she could see both the sleek visitor center illuminated against the twilight sky and the conservation structure protecting the Santa Isabella itself, past and present in perfect balance. The juxtaposition embodied the project's fundamental philosophy, honoring history while making it accessible to contemporary understanding. 5 years of intensive work had yielded discoveries beyond anyone's expectations. The Santa Isabella's cargo, valued initially for its gold and silver, had proven far more precious for its historical artifacts. Personal letters, official documents, navigational charts, and everyday items had collectively rewritten understanding of colonial Spanish America and its complex relationship with indigenous populations and European powers. Most significant had been the diplomatic papers found in the captain's quarters, revealing previously unknown negotiations between Spain and colonial leaders decades before the American Revolution, evidence of international power dynamics that had shaped the founding of the United States in ways historians were still analyzing. These documents alone had spawned 3 international academic conferences, dozens of scholarly publications, and a complete reassessment of Spain's role in early American independence movements. What Thomas had initially suspected might be historically significant had proven revolutionary to historical understanding. Beyond academic achievements, the discovery had transformed countless individual lives. The Thomas Wilson Educational Trust now provided scholarships for over 50 students annually pursuing studies in history, archaeology, and conservation. The Foundation's internship program had launched careers for promising young researchers from disadvantaged backgrounds. Local community members had found employment opportunities in the visitor center, research facilities, and supporting tourism infrastructure. Margaret had deliberately maintained her modest lifestyle despite her portion of the treasure's value, using the majority of her personal funds to establish additional educational and community development initiatives. The greatest luxury she had allowed herself was the renovation of Thomas's weekend cabin into a comfortable year-round residence, maintaining its simple character while adding modern conveniences. As darkness settled completely over the landscape, stars appearing in the clear Florida sky, Margaret reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought her here. She had never sought this role as steward of a historical treasure, had never imagined herself overseeing international research partnerships or testifying before congressional committees on archaeological preservation policies. Yet each step had followed naturally from a single principle, honoring Thomas's belief that historical knowledge possessed value transcending monetary measurement. By remaining faithful to that core value, she had navigated complex challenges that might otherwise have seemed overwhelming. "You were right all along," she whispered into the evening breeze, the words meant for Thomas though she knew he couldn't hear them. Not just about the ship, but about what truly matters. The following morning, as the visitor center welcomed its first public guests, Margaret observed from a discreet distance as people of all ages engaged with the interactive exhibits, their expressions reflecting wonder, curiosity, and the distinctive excitement of connection with the past. Children pressed their noses against protective glass to glimpse actual centuries-old artifacts, while adults studied informational displays with scholarly concentration. A documentary film crew from a prestigious historical channel approached, requesting an interview about the discovery's ongoing significance. Margaret agreed with her characteristic modesty, deflecting praise toward the research team while emphasizing Thomas's foundational contribution. 5 years after the initial discovery, what do you consider its most important legacy? The interviewer asked as cameras rolled. Margaret considered the question carefully, looking beyond the obvious answers about historical reassessment or archaeological techniques. "The most important legacy is what it teaches us about perception and persistence," she finally replied. "This discovery reminds us that extraordinary value often exists where others see only worthlessness, that conventional wisdom frequently blinds us to remarkable possibilities, and that sometimes the most significant breakthroughs come only after decades of faith in what others cannot yet see." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My husband spent 30 years searching when everyone, including me at times, thought he was wasting his effort. The land was dismissed as worthless, his theories as far-fetched, his persistence as mere obsession. In honoring his persistence, she had discovered her own capacity for bringing his vision to fruition, for navigating challenges he couldn't have anticipated, for expanding a personal quest into a global historical resource. The Santa Isabella's treasure, initially valued for gold and silver, had proven immeasurably more precious for its historical revelations, educational opportunities, and inspiration to question conventional assessments of worth. What everyone had dismissed as worthless had yielded value beyond calculation, not just in monetary terms but in expanded human knowledge and understanding. As Margaret prepared for sleep, surrounded by Thomas's books, maps and memories, she felt not the completion of a journey but its evolution into something self-sustaining. The research would continue for decades, each discovery revealing new questions. Students inspired by the Santa Isabella story would pursue their own historical mysteries, perhaps finding answers Thomas never imagined. The ripples would expand indefinitely, touching lives far beyond Blackwater, Florida. The greatest treasure, Margaret had come to understand, lay not in what was found but in the transformation of those who found it, in the expanded perception that recognized value where others saw worthlessness, in the persistence that continued seeking truth when conventional wisdom declared the search foolish, in the courage to follow conviction rather than consensus. Thomas Wilson's worthless Swampland had yielded a fortune beyond gold, the vindication of unwavering belief, the fulfillment of lifelong purpose, and the profound satisfaction of proving that sometimes our greatest discoveries lie hidden just beneath the surface of what others have dismissed as meaningless. His legacy would endure not just in archaeological records or museum displays, but in the countless minds inspired to question, explore, and persist in seeking their own buried treasures of knowledge and understanding. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.